He didn't believe in God. He considered the soul a fiction, spirituality, a weakness of the mind. Viktor Veinik was a Soviet scientist, a doctor of technical sciences, a thermophysicist, a man of equations and formulas. He spent his life explaining the world through numbers, and it was the numbers that led him somewhere he never intended to go. His books were burned, literally, hundreds of copies, decades of work, destroyed on government orders. A colleague watching the flames muttered grimly, "It's good they're burning books and not authors." Veinik answered with the words of Giordano Bruno, "To burn is not to refute." At a seminar at the Ivanovo Medical Institute, he stepped up to the podium and said calmly, without emotion, "I hear that people who love all things mysterious have gathered here. I have no intention of disappointing you, but I won't be departing from materialist science." The audience expected another dry lecture. What followed held everyone in the room until the very end. Vejnik argued that the universe is a system of levels. We live in a macro world governed by the laws taught in school. Inside it, a micro world. Deeper still, subtle layers of reality he called the picoworld, the femtoworld, the attoworld. It is there that processes occur which physics cannot explain. And it is there, as he discovered, that something lies hidden which changes everything. These worlds exist simultaneously and permeate one another, not like matryoshka dolls placed one inside another, but like matryoshka dolls dissolved into one another. The objects of these worlds exist outside time and space. They are literally diffused throughout our entire world. They cannot be touched. And yet it is they that shape what we call consciousness. Our consciousness, Vejnik explained, does not obey the laws of time and space. It operates according to different rules, those that govern the subtle dimensions of being. This is precisely why a human being is capable of things science cannot explain. Reading thoughts, sensing danger, influencing objects at a distance, diagnosing illness, predicting events. This is not fantasy. It is the consequence of the fact that consciousness is rooted in deeper levels of existence. The room sat motionless. A scientist who had spent his entire life denying God was now saying what priests and mystics say, but doing it coldly, logically, without a trace of esotericism. Only facts, only theory grounded in observation. And that was precisely what made it convincing. He gave example after example. He explained poltergeists as manifestations of objects from the subtle world. He described why they appear in places where someone is seeking contact with the beyond. He spoke of UFOs and the particular chronal fields they leave behind. People fell ill and died from spending too much time in such locations. These are not myths, he kept repeating. Humanity simply isn't ready yet to admit that something exists beyond the boundary of the ordinary world. At that point, he still didn't allow for God. Subtle worlds, yes. A creator, no. But this was only one stage. 15 years later, he would encounter something that would bring him to his knees. He wasn't looking for faith, he wasn't waiting for any sign. One day his own body failed him, and he ended up in hospital. And on the neighboring bed lay an old priest, thin, exhausted, with lung cancer, fading before his eyes, but radiating a peace as if he already knew the answers to the questions Vejnik had wrestled with his entire life. They lay together in the same room. The scientist listened skeptically at first. The priest spoke of God, of light and darkness, of the struggle between good and evil, of the human soul. Nothing new, thought Vejnik. He had heard all of this before and always dismissed it. But this time something resonated deep inside, as if he had seen these images before, not in the Bible, but in his own formulas and diagrams. Suddenly I understood, Vejnik later recalled. Everything this man is talking about, I have already described, only in different words. These were my objects of the subtle worlds. I had measured them myself, recorded their positive and negative charge. And this is exactly what Holy Scripture speaks about. He didn't know how to take this. His mind resisted, but his heart was beginning to give in. He picked up the Bible and read it again from the beginning. With every page it became more unsettling, because the coincidences were too precise. The words of the ancient book were overlapping with his own calculations. Then the priest said to him quietly, "Repent, accept baptism. Perhaps the illness will recede." The doctors had just finished their tests and were speaking of serious grounds for concern. And Veinik, the man of formulas and equations, walked into a church for the first time. He didn't know what to expect. When he crossed the threshold, his head began to spin. He fainted. He fell and hit the back of his head hard. An ambulance came. From then on, he only went to the church with someone accompanying him. But the illness began to retreat. The weakness disappeared. He felt alive again. "It's hard to believe," he said afterward, "but I began to recover." That same year he was baptized. He was 73 years old. Of the priest from the hospital room, he said later, "That old man opened my eyes. Through him I understood that truth can come not from a laboratory, but through simple words, through kindness, through an inner light." He began reading the sacred books differently, not as a critic, as a man who is searching. And with every passing day he became more convinced that his theory did not contradict religion. It complemented it. It simply described the same thing in different words. Vejnik arrived at a conclusion that surprised even himself. Around us there genuinely exists something invisible but entirely real. Objects with a positive charge carry light. Objects with a negative charge bring destruction, illness, fear. Icons, consecrated objects, temples, these are positive. Poltergeists and UFOs, negative. The dark side. A human being can not only sense this influence, but enter into contact with it. And here, Vejnik came to a conclusion that astonished him. Saints communicate with good spirits, psychics and clairvoyants, with dark ones. The deeper he went, the more clearly he saw. Ordinary logic was no longer enough here. Around us, forces operate that we cannot see but can feel. They live their own life and fit no equation. A person may not even suspect they are entering into contact with something beyond the known world. Sometimes it happens through dreams, sometimes through an inexplicable feeling of fear or peace in a moment when everything should be terrible. He no longer laughed at those who believe in life after death, because he himself now knew it exists. It simply looks different from what we imagine. There was another man who didn't just study this. He went through it himself, and what he brought back from the other side confirmed everything Vejnik had spent decades calculating. Arthur Ford was one of the most famous mediums of the 20th century. Some called him a charlatan, others a genius. But even skeptics admitted one thing. He described what was on the other side with a specificity that is impossible to invent. Ford knew his heart would be the final boundary. He had been ill for years. One day, those close to him said their goodbyes. The doctors said, "No chance." He lay on the hospital bed, pale and exhausted. And then it began. He saw himself leaving his own body, without fear, without pain. Simply stepped out, and found himself above the bed looking down. For the first time in years, lightness, silence, and a complete absence of fear. From all sides, people started approaching him. Faces he knew, though unseen for years. Someone from childhood, someone from a life that had almost faded from memory, all of them dead, all of them smiling. They spoke without words, and he recognized them not by their faces, by the feeling, by an inner light that was unique to each of them. Those who had died old looked young. Those who had left as children had become adults, everyone at their absolute best, as if each had chosen who they wanted to be. He was shaken most deeply by one thing. Time on the other side had no meaning whatsoever. None. It simply did not exist as a category, which meant that the soul, without cells, without biology, without the machinery of aging, does not age either. It simply removes a heavy coat. Everyone he encountered there was in the fullness of their strength. Even those who on earth had departed in suffering looked as they had in their best days, as if the pain had stayed on this side of the boundary, and from the other side came only light. He described seeing souls who by earthly measure were thousands of years old, and they looked like people in their 40s. Calm, strong, clear. Because in a place without time there is no wear, no decay. The face there reflects not age, but who you actually are. Ford chose to appear at 45, the age at which he had felt most completely himself. No one forced the choice. He simply knew that was right. And everyone around him had made the same kind of choice, each appearing as the fullest version of themselves, the version the body had often obscured. During one of his final sessions, he described a vast hall where his entire life was shown to him from beginning to end. Not with reproach, as if someone were calmly reminding him of every word, every glance, what each of his actions had set in motion, who had suffered, who had been helped without knowing it. He understood. Nothing is forgotten. Not a single moment. Everything matters. And it wasn't punishment. It was clarity, pure, complete, impossible to turn away from. The soul is not a part of a person, Ford said. It is the person, the real one, the one invisible in the mirror, the one that has outlived all bodies, all roles, all masks. When someone says of a person they once knew, "I don't recognize him," they may simply not have recognized the soul, because the soul on the other side is visible, clearly, in the way it shines, in what you feel in its presence before a single word is spoken. He passed in January 1971. He was 73, but those who knew him closely said he did not disappear. He continued to speak through those who were sensitive enough to hear. To one of the final questions, what awaits us after death, he gave no universal answer. He said, "It depends on who you are and what your soul holds. What you bring with you is what you will find. But if you're asking me directly, my answer is this: peace, light, and truth, and above all, love, the kind that needs no words, demands no proof, and never leaves." Veinik the scientist and Ford the medium arrived at the same place by entirely different roads, one through equations and thermodynamics, the other through the experience of his own dying. One spent decades measuring the objects of the subtle world with instruments. The other simply found himself there and looked around. And what they described, the structure beneath physical reality, the consciousness that exists independently of the body, the recognition of those we loved by something that has no name in any language, was the same picture, drawn from two completely different angles, meeting in the same point. Write in the comments, which of these two stories stayed with you longer? The Soviet scientist who found his way to God through his own formulas, or what Ford described, recognizing those you love, not by their face, but by the light they carry.